The first time Nora Bennett knocked on Owen Carter's front door, she wasn't carrying Flowers' luggage, or even an umbrella. She carried a metal cash box. It was nearly 11 at night, and the October wind howled across the hills hard enough to shake the porch swing that hadn't been used since Owen's mother passed away 3 winters earlier. Rain lashed against the old farmhouse, blurring the lights of the distant barns until they looked like pale stars drowning behind glass. Owen had just finished repairing a broken irrigation pump. His hands still smelled of grease, and his dinner, a bowl of stew gone cold, sat untouched on the kitchen table. The pounding on the door came once, then again, then a third time, harder than before. No one visited his place after dark. People around Briar Ridge respected boundaries. If someone came this late, it usually meant livestock had escaped, a family emergency, or the sheriff. He opened the door expecting bad news. Instead, he found Nora Bennett standing there. For a moment he simply stared. She looked nothing like the confident woman he'd occasionally seen helping customers at Bennett Orchard. Her dark hair clung to her face, soaked through by the rain. Mud stained the hem of her jeans. She held the dented metal cash box against her chest, with both arms, as though letting go of it would cause everything else in her life to fall apart. "Owen," she whispered. Her voice sounded like she'd been crying for hours. He stepped aside immediately. "Get inside." She entered without another word. The warmth of the farmhouse hit her, yet she continued shivering. Owen closed the door and locked it before grabbing the old towel hanging beside the sink. "Here." She accepted it with trembling fingers. "Thank you." He pointed toward the kitchen. "Sit down." She obeyed this time. Normally Nora carried herself with quiet confidence. Even after her father's death 6 months earlier, she'd greeted people with a polite smile whenever their paths crossed in town. Tonight that confidence had disappeared. She looked exhausted. Not physically, completely. Owen filled the kettle because silence felt heavier than movement. "What happened?" She placed the cash box carefully on the table. For several seconds she simply stared at it. Finally she flipped the rusted latch open. Inside were neatly bundled documents, old letters, a worn leather journal, and several envelopes marked with her father's handwriting. "My grandfather's trust," she said quietly. Owen frowned. "I thought everything had already gone through probate." "So did I." She slid a folded legal document across the table. "The attorney called me this afternoon." Owen didn't touch it. Legal language always made him uncomfortable. "I don't understand this stuff." "I barely do." The kettle began to whistle. He poured 2 mugs of tea neither of them had asked for. Only after wrapping both hands around the warm cup did Nora continue. "My grandfather left the orchard to my father." Owen nodded. Everyone knew that. Bennett Orchard had supplied apples, peaches, and cherries to 3 counties for nearly 50 years. "My father inherited everything." She hesitated. "Except absolute ownership." Owen looked up. "What does that mean?" She forced herself to meet his eyes. The trust included a condition. His stomach tightened. "What kind of condition?" She swallowed. "If I don't meet it before next Monday." Her voice cracked. "My cousin Victor becomes managing trustee." The room became very quiet. Owen had met Victor Bennett exactly twice. That had been enough. Victor treated orchards like spreadsheets. He talked about profit margins while standing among trees planted by his grandfather. Last spring he'd publicly suggested replacing half the apple groves with luxury cabins because tourists paid better than fruit. Even people who disliked farming hadn't liked hearing that. "What condition?" Owen asked again. Nora looked away. "I have to be legally married." He blinked. "What?" "The trust says the family property can only pass to an heir who has established a permanent household." She laughed bitterly. "My grandfather believed stable families made better caretakers." "When's the deadline?" 5 days. The wind rattled the windows. Neither of them spoke. Finally Owen asked the obvious question. "And Victor knows." "I found out before I did." She reached into the cash box again and removed another envelope. "He already has investors touring the orchard." Owen's jaw tightened. "They can't do that." "They can if they think they're taking over next week." She rubbed her forehead. "They're already talking about cutting down the oldest trees." That sentence landed harder than she probably realized. Owen had grown up beside those orchards. He remembered climbing ladders with his father during harvest festivals. Some of those apple trees were older than anyone still living in Briar Ridge. "You came all the way here because..." She answered before he finished. "Because you're the only person I trust." He stared at her. "We barely know each other." "I know. You've got friends. They've already told me to hire lawyers." "Maybe they're right." "I did." She smiled without humor. "The lawyers explained exactly how impossible it would be to fight before the deadline." The old clock above the refrigerator ticked loudly. Owen suddenly realized she hadn't actually asked yet. Not directly. She didn't have to. The question was already sitting between them. I can't believe this, he murmured. I couldn't either. She looked down at the wedding band still resting in its unopened jewelry box inside the cash box. My grandfather bought these years ago. Owen frowned. Years ago. He always believed I'd meet someone eventually. Her smile disappeared. He just never imagined I'd be counting days. She took a slow breath. Owen. He raised one hand. Don't. I have to. No. She looked at him anyway. I'm asking you to marry me. The words hung in the kitchen like thunder that refused to fade. Outside, rain hammered against the roof. Inside, the old farmhouse seemed to hold its breath. Owen stood and walked to the window. Across the fields, darkness swallowed everything beyond the fence lines. He'd spent 34 years building a quiet life. His days were predictable. Morning chores, repairs, harvests, evenings alone. That loneliness had become familiar enough not to hurt anymore. Marriage wasn't supposed to arrive on a stormy Thursday because a desperate woman appeared carrying legal documents. He turned back toward the table. Nora. She didn't interrupt. I can't pretend marriage is paperwork. I'm not asking you to pretend. You are. No. She shook her head. I'm asking for help. There wasn't a trace of manipulation in her voice. Only honesty. Painfully honest honesty. I'll sign whatever agreement you want. She continued. If you decide to leave after everything settles, I won't fight you. Owen remained silent. She lowered her eyes. I know this isn't fair. Nope. It isn't. I've spent 6 hours driving from office to office hoping someone would tell me there was another option. There isn't. She slowly shook her head. No. The fire crackled softly inside the old cast iron stove. Owen thought about the Bennett orchard. About the spring blossoms covering entire hillsides. About children picking apples every autumn. About Victor replacing all of it with vacation homes and parking lots. He hated the idea. But marriage. That was different. He looked at Nora again. She wasn't asking for romance. She wasn't promising love. She was simply trying to save the only home she'd ever known. He chose every word carefully. If I say yes. Hope flickered across her face. There are rules. She nodded immediately. No lies. I understand. No pretending we're in love. I won't. No secrets about the orchard. You'll know everything. And once this starts. He looked directly into her eyes. We face whatever comes together. For the first time that night, tears escaped down her cheeks. She wiped them away quickly. I can promise that. Owen let out a long breath. He wasn't sure whether he was making the smartest decision of his life or the biggest mistake. All right? She froze. We'll go to the courthouse tomorrow morning. For several seconds, she simply stared at him. Then she quietly closed the cash box. Thank you. He gave a small nod. Don't thank me yet. She looked puzzled. He glanced toward the rain-soaked darkness outside. Something tells me saving an orchard is going to be the easy part. The courthouse in Briar Ridge occupied the second floor of a century-old brick building overlooking the town square. It wasn't grand or impressive. The hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, and the fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. By 9 o'clock Friday morning, Owen and Nora stood outside the clerk's office in complete silence. Neither had slept much. Nora wore a simple cream-colored sweater beneath a charcoal coat. Her hair was neatly tied back, though a few loose strands framed her face. Owen had changed into the cleanest denim shirt he owned, one his sister had bought him years ago before moving across the country. He felt strangely underdressed for becoming someone's husband. The clerk smiled politely. Marriage license. Nora nodded. Yes, ma'am. Within 30 minutes, they had signed every document placed before them. There were no flowers, no guests, no music, only the quiet scratching of pens across official papers. The local judge, a gray-haired woman known for settling property disputes as often as weddings, looked over her glasses before beginning. I've officiated marriages for nearly 20 years, she said warmly. They all begin differently. Owen glanced sideways at Nora. She looked straight ahead. The judge continued with the ceremony. The words were simple. Promises, commitments, signatures. When she finally declared them husband and wife, Owen felt no fireworks. Only responsibility. A surprisingly heavy one. Outside, the autumn wind carried the scent of damp leaves across the courthouse steps. Nora stared down at the wedding band now resting on her finger. It feels unreal. It probably should. She laughed quietly. I suppose that's fair. Owen unlocked his pickup. Ready, she nodded. I guess I'm moving in. Owen's farmhouse had never been built for two people. Not anymore. The front porch leaned slightly to one side. The kitchen cabinet squeaked. The upstairs hallway creaked loudly enough to announce every late-night trip for water. Still, it was clean, comfortable. Lived in. He carried Nora's 2 suitcases upstairs while she carefully brought in the metal cash box herself. She noticed immediately that he'd prepared the guest room. Fresh sheets, clean towels, a vase holding wildflowers picked from the roadside. You didn't have to do this. I know, she smiled. But you did. He shrugged awkwardly. My mother always said a guest should feel welcome. Nora looked around quietly. I don't think I'm a guest. The realization settled between them. No, she wasn't. She lived there now. The first weekend passed awkwardly. They bumped into each other constantly. She apologized every time she opened the refrigerator. He apologized whenever he entered the kitchen while she was cooking. By Sunday afternoon, both had apologized so many times it became almost funny. Finally Owen sighed. We've got to stop saying sorry. I know. You live here. I know. So quit asking permission to use the toaster. She laughed. I can't help it. You can. I've been here exactly 48 hours. Long enough to butter toast without requesting authorization. She rolled her eyes. Fine. Progress. For the first time since she'd arrived, the tension eased. Monday morning they drove to Bennett Orchard before sunrise. The property stretched across rolling hills painted gold by autumn. Rows of apple trees disappeared into the morning mist. To Owen, it looked beautiful. To Nora, it looked overwhelming. Workers were already unloading equipment near the packing barn. Conversations stopped as soon as Owen's truck rolled into the yard. People watched, not rudely, curiously. Small towns had a remarkable ability to learn news before breakfast. Nora climbed out first. Her shoulders straightened. Morning. A few workers answered politely. Others simply nodded. Then a voice called from behind the loading dock. Well. Victor Bennett appeared wearing pressed jeans, polished boots, and a tailored jacket entirely unsuited for orchard work. He smiled broadly. If it isn't the newlyweds. Nora remained calm. Morning, Victor. I've got to admit. He looked Owen up and down. I didn't expect this. Owen met his gaze. I imagine not. Victor chuckled. Clever move. It wasn't a move. No. He folded his arms. Marrying the quiet neighbor just before the deadline. He looked towards several workers standing nearby. Quite romantic. Nobody laughed. Victor's smile faded slightly. I assume you're both enjoying married life. We're busy, Nora answered. I can see that. He stepped closer. I've already spoken with 3 investment firms. Nora's expression hardened. I told you the orchard isn't for sale. You told me. He smiled again. The paperwork hasn't. Owen spoke for the first time. The paperwork says she's in charge. Victor looked at him. For now, the words lingered. Not quite a threat, not quite a promise. Somewhere unpleasantly between. After Victor drove away, Nora remained standing beside the loading dock. He won't stop. No. He really believes I'll fail. Owen looked across the orchard. He doesn't need you to fail. She frowned. What do you mean? He just needs everyone else to believe you will. She considered that quietly. Confidence, Owen knew, wasn't only about making good decisions. Sometimes it was convincing everyone else you could. Afternoon Owen walked Nora through every section of the orchard: storage sheds, equipment garages, packing lines, irrigation controls. She carried a notebook everywhere. What are you writing? Everything. You don't have to. I do. She pointed toward an aging tractor. What year? 1998. She wrote it down. The north irrigation pump. Installed 12 years ago. She wrote again. The western storage roof leaks after heavy snow. Another note. Owen smiled. You planning to memorize the whole place? I'm planning not to lose it. There was no humor in her answer. Only determination. Tuesday brought the season's first real challenge. A shipment of apples scheduled for Wednesday morning had been delayed because one of the refrigeration units failed overnight. The workers gathered outside the warehouse waiting for instructions. Several instinctively looked toward Owen. He noticed, so did Nora. Without saying anything, Owen busied himself inspecting a nearby trailer hitch. The silence stretched. Finally Nora cleared her throat. Everyone. Heads turned toward her. We'll move the Honeycrisp harvest into cold storage too. One worker frowned. That unit's nearly full. I checked inventory this morning. She opened her notebook. The southern aisle has enough space if we reorganize yesterday's shipment. The crew exchanged uncertain glances. Another employee asked carefully, and who's handling the repairs? I already called Mason Refrigeration. When? Half an hour ago. Someone blinked. They're coming. This afternoon. There was another pause. Then the oldest worker among them, Harold, who'd worked the orchard for over 30 years, gave a slow nod. All right. The others followed. Within minutes everyone returned to work. Owen watched quietly from across the yard. Nora walked over afterward. You knew they'd look at you. Yes. You ignored them. Yes. That wasn't very nice. It wasn't supposed to be. She sighed. I know. But they listened. She looked back toward the workers now reorganizing storage crates. They actually listened. They'll do it again. How can you be sure? Because today they followed you. He smiled slightly. Tomorrow it'll feel normal. That evening Nora cooked dinner. Nothing elaborate. Roasted potatoes. Chicken, fresh apples baked with cinnamon for dessert. As Owen washed the dishes afterward, he noticed she was humming quietly while sorting paperwork across the kitchen table. The house felt different. Warmer somehow, not because of the food, because someone else occupied the silence. Later, as he headed upstairs, he noticed a small handwritten note taped to the refrigerator. Milk fence supplies, call insurance, replace porch light. He smiled to himself. The empty farmhouse no longer felt quite so empty. But neither of them noticed the black SUV parked half a mile away on the county road. Its driver sat watching the farmhouse through binoculars before quietly turning around and disappearing into the darkness. Neither Owen nor Nora had any idea that Victor's next move had already begun. The following morning began with a phone call. Owen was halfway through replacing a broken fence post behind his barn when Nora's truck came racing down the gravel lane. She barely waited for the engine to stop before climbing out. There was someone at the orchard before sunrise. Owen set the post driver aside. What happened? Harold called me. She brushed loose hair behind her ear, still catching her breath. He found fresh tire tracks near the eastern storage shed. Anything missing? No, any damage. She hesitated. Not exactly. He frowned. What does that mean? They left something. They reached the orchard 20 minutes later. Several workers stood near the loading dock. On the large bulletin board where employee schedules were normally posted, someone had nailed a bright yellow sign. Comandi suo liexurigi estas ein edu visa and far redigi. Below the words was an artist's rendering of elegant vacation homes standing exactly where the oldest apple trees now grew. Someone had crossed out the word ORCR'd with thick black paint. Nora stared at it in silence. Harold quietly removed his cap. I found it like this. Owen studied the sign. No company logo, no signature. Just enough to plant doubt. Victor didn't need permission to unsettle people. He only needed rumors. Nora reached up, pulled the sign free, folded it in half, then in half again. She dropped it into a trash barrel. We've got work to do. No speech. No dramatic declaration. She simply picked up the day's schedule and handed assignments to the crew. One by one, everyone returned to work. Only Harold remained. He watched Nora disappear between the rows of apple trees before speaking quietly to Owen. She's tougher than people think. Owen smiled. She's figuring that out herself. Business improved during the next week. A regional grocery chain renewed its contract with the orchard. Nora negotiated the deal herself. When she hung up the office phone, she leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. I did it? Owen looked up from repairing a crate. What? I didn't call you first. You didn't need to. I know. She laughed. That's the strange part. He could hear the confidence growing in her voice, not loud, not boastful, just earned. Their evenings settled into an easy rhythm. Owen handled chores at his farm before driving over to help finish work at the orchard. Nora usually arrived home first. Dinner slowly became something they shared, instead of something they happened to eat in the same house. One night she experimented with homemade bread. It came out so dense that Owen joked it could repair potholes. She laughed so hard she nearly dropped the loaf. Another evening Owen attempted one of his late mother's pie recipes. The filling overflowed into the oven, filling the kitchen with smoke. Nora opened every window while laughing uncontrollably. I thought you said you could bake. I said I watched my mother bake. Very different skills. I've discovered that. For the first time in years, laughter echoed through the old farmhouse. It stayed there long after the smoke disappeared. Saturday brought the annual Briar Ridge Harvest Market. Normally Nora loved attending. This year she almost stayed home. Everyone's gonna stare. Owen adjusted a crate of apples in the truck bed. They probably will. That doesn't help. They'll stare for 5 minutes. And then they'll start talking about someone else's business. She smiled. Small town wisdom. Experience. The market filled the town square with music, handmade crafts, pumpkins, and fresh produce. Children chased one another between booths while local musicians played old country songs beneath the gazebo. As expected, people noticed them immediately. Some smiled warmly. Others whispered. Most were simply curious. Nora answered every congratulations with polite grace. By lunchtime, she realized something. Nobody seemed interested in gossip anymore. They wanted apples. They wanted cider. They wanted to know when fresh peach preserves would be available again. Business replaced speculation. That alone felt like a victory. Late that afternoon, an elderly woman approached the Bennett Orchard booth. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks had been buying apples there longer than Nora had been alive. She picked up a Honeycrisp, inspected it carefully, then nodded with approval. Your father would be proud. Nora swallowed. I hope so. Mrs. Though. Brooks placed both weathered hands over Nora's. I know so. Then she quietly walked away carrying 2 bags of apples. Nora remained still for several seconds. Owen pretended to rearrange baskets, giving her a moment. When she looked up again, her eyes glistened. I've been waiting to hear that. I figured. Victor chose that exact moment to appear. He wore another tailored jacket. Another polished pair of boots. Another perfectly rehearsed smile. What a touching scene. Neither Owen nor Nora answered. Victor picked up one of the apples. So this is the future you're fighting for. He turned it slowly in his hand. A few pieces of fruit. Nora met his eyes. Numb, she gently took the apple back and returned it to the display. My family's work. Victor leaned closer. You still don't understand? No. She smiled calmly. I understand perfectly. You can't stop progress. I don't intend to. He frowned. I'm stopping you. Several nearby shoppers glanced toward them. Victor lowered his voice. You'll make one mistake. Everyone does. And when you do, he looked toward Owen. Your husband won't be able to save you. Before Nora could answer, Owen spoke quietly. She doesn't need saving. Victor laughed once. We'll see. He walked away without buying anything. Nora watched him disappear into the crowd. He isn't giving up. No. She folded her arms. Neither am I. That evening, as they unloaded the remaining produce back at the orchard, Harold approached carrying a sealed envelope. This came by courier. Nora frowned. There wasn't a return address. She opened it carefully. Inside was a professionally prepared offer. A development corporation proposed purchasing the entire Bennett orchard for nearly 3 times its estimated value. Attached to the offer was a handwritten note. This won't be the last chance you get. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Nora folded the papers slowly. What are you thinking? Owen asked. She looked across the orchard. The sun was setting behind rows of trees her grandfather had planted with his own hands. I think. She slipped the offer back into the envelope. They're finally realizing I won't quit. Owen nodded. And that makes them dangerous. She looked at him. Then I suppose we'd better be smarter than they are. For the first time since the unexpected marriage began, they weren't simply reacting to problems anymore. They were preparing for a fight they both knew was coming. By the second week of November, the orchard looked different. Not because the trees had changed. Because the people working among them had. The uncertainty that had lingered after Nora inherited the property had slowly begun to disappear. Workers stopped looking over their shoulders before making decisions. Orders were arriving on time. The packing line ran smoother than it had in months. Even Harold admitted one afternoon, feels like we're farming again. Nora smiled when she heard it, though she tried not to show how much those words meant. One cold Tuesday morning, Owen found her standing alone near the highest hill on the property. From there, the entire orchard stretched beneath them in neat rows fading into the valley. She held a mug of coffee in both hands. I used to come up here with my dad, she said quietly. He'd stand exactly where you are. Owen slipped his hands into his jacket pockets. What would he say? Mostly nothing. She smiled faintly. He believed some places didn't need conversation. They stood together in comfortable silence. The wind carried the scent of apples and damp leaves across the hillside. Finally Nora spoke again. I spent weeks trying to become him. You can't. I know. I think. She looked across the valley. I'm finally learning how to become myself instead. Owen nodded. That's what he probably wanted. 2 days later, trouble arrived without warning. Just after lunch, Harold rushed into the office carrying a clipboard. Nora. She looked up. What happened? State inspectors. Her eyebrows lifted. Inspectors. They're checking every storage building. Owen looked through the office window. 3 government vehicles had pulled into the yard. Men and women wearing county identification badges were already walking toward the warehouse. Nora stood. Did someone file a complaint? Harold answered carefully. They said it was anonymous. Owen didn't need to guess. Victor. The inspection lasted nearly 6 hours. Every storage room. Every refrigeration unit. Every maintenance log. Every safety record. Workers grew nervous as clipboards filled with notes. By sunset the lead inspector approached Nora. We've completed our review. She braced herself. He handed back her paperwork. I'll be honest. She waited. We expected serious violations. He looked around the orchard. We didn't find any. Nora blinked. There are a few maintenance recommendations. He smiled politely. But overall, he extended his hand. You're running a very well-organized operation. After the inspectors left, Harold grinned beneath his gray mustache. Someone's going to be disappointed. Owen looked toward the county road. I imagine he already is. That evening the farmhouse felt unusually peaceful. Rain tapped gently against the windows while Nora prepared soup in the kitchen. Owen chopped vegetables beside her. Neither noticed how naturally they moved around each other now. No awkward apologies. No hesitation. She reached for the pepper. He handed it to her before she asked. He opened the oven. She placed the bread inside. Simple things. Comfortable things. When dinner was ready, they carried their bowls to the old wooden table. Halfway through the meal, Nora set down her spoon. Can I ask you something? Sure. Were you lonely? Owen looked at her. Before all this? He considered the question carefully. I told myself I wasn't. And now? He smiled a little. Now I realize quiet and lonely aren't the same thing. She looked down into her bowl. I was lonely. You had the orchard. I had responsibilities. She laughed softly. They're not always good company. They both smiled. Outside, the wind rattled the porch swing again. Inside, the silence no longer felt empty. The next Saturday brought the town's annual charity auction. Local farms donated produce, handmade furniture, quilts, and baked goods to raise money for the volunteer fire department. Nora almost declined the invitation. Owen convinced her otherwise. People need to see you're part of this town. I've always been part of this town. You've always lived here. He smiled. Different thing. She sighed. You keep making annoying amounts of sense. I've practiced. The community hall buzzed with conversation. Neighbors greeted them warmly. More warmly than either expected. Mrs. Brooks hugged Nora. Several farmers congratulated her on the successful harvest. Children waved as they carried caramel apples around the room. Victor arrived halfway through the evening. This time he wasn't smiling. He crossed the hall and stopped in front of Nora. I heard about the inspection. She nodded. They found nothing. So I heard? His voice stayed calm. Almost too calm. You've been busy? So have you. For several seconds neither looked away. Finally Victor leaned closer. You think you've won? No. Nora's voice remained steady. I think the orchard is finally being judged by the people who actually work here. His expression hardened. You've changed. She smiled. I know. Victor looked briefly toward Owen. I underestimated both of you. Then, without another word, he walked away. Owen watched him disappear into the crowd. That sounded almost like respect. Nora shook her head. No. What then? A finally realized intimidation isn't working. And that's dangerous. She nodded slowly. Because people who lose control often make desperate choices. 3 nights later, desperation finally showed itself. Just after midnight, Owen woke to the sound of barking. His old sheepdog, Rusty, never barked without reason. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside. The cold air bit immediately. Rusty stood near the gravel driveway, growling toward the orchard road. Headlights. A truck. Moving slowly. Too slowly. Owen grabbed a flashlight and climbed into his pickup. By the time he reached the orchard entrance, the other vehicle was already speeding away. He couldn't catch it. But he found what had been left behind. The main entrance sign lay shattered on the ground. Someone had driven directly through it before disappearing into the darkness. Nora arrived minutes later, still wearing her coat over pajamas. She stared silently at the broken sign. The carved wooden letters reading Ben Etor Shiard were split in two. For a long moment she didn't move. Owen expected tears. Instead she knelt beside the broken wood. She picked up one of the carved letters carefully and brushed dirt from its surface. Then she stood. We'll build another. He looked at her. That's all. She nodded. If someone thinks breaking a sign is enough to break me. A calm smile crossed her face. They haven't been paying attention. As dawn slowly spread across the hills, workers began arriving one by one. Without being asked, Harold brought lumber. Another employee brought paint. Someone else delivered new hardware. Nobody complained. Nobody questioned. By noon, everyone was working together. Not because they had to. Because they wanted to. Watching them rebuild the entrance, Owen realized something had quietly changed. Weeks earlier, the orchard had belonged to Nora on paper. Now, it belonged to a community that had chosen to stand beside her. And for the first time since that stormy night she knocked on his door, Owen believed they might actually win. The new entrance sign stood finished by Monday morning. It wasn't as polished as the original. The edges were rough in places, and the lettering wasn't perfectly centered. But every person who worked at Bennett Orchard had touched it in some way. Harold carved the oak. 2 teenagers from town painted the lettering. Mrs. Brooks brought coffee and homemade biscuits before sunrise. By the time the last coat of varnish dried, the sign meant far more than the one that had been destroyed. It wasn't simply a marker anymore, it was a promise. The promise was tested sooner than anyone expected. On Wednesday afternoon, Nora received a certified letter from the county planning office. She unfolded it slowly while Owen watched from across the kitchen. What is it? She read the first page, then the second. Finally she let out a long breath. It's a hearing. For what? Victor. She handed him the letter. He filed a petition claiming the orchard is being financially mismanaged. Owen frowned. He already tried inspections. I know. This is different. She nodded. If the county believes I'm neglecting the property, they could appoint temporary oversight while they investigate. And that's exactly what he wants. She folded the letter carefully. The hearing's Friday. Friday morning arrived cold and clear. The county administration building wasn't nearly as intimidating as Nora remembered from her first visit weeks earlier. This time she wasn't carrying a metal cash box. She carried organized binders, financial records, maintenance logs, harvest reports, employee schedules, contracts, everything she'd learned to manage herself. Owen walked beside her but never reached for the binders. She carried them without difficulty. Inside the hearing room, Victor sat confidently at one end of the table. He looked as though he'd already decided the outcome. The county chairperson called the meeting to order. Mr. Bennett, you filed the complaint. Please proceed. Victor stood. He spoke smoothly. Professionally, he argued that Nora lacked experience, that the orchard faced unnecessary financial risks, that sentimental decisions were replacing practical management. When he finished, several board members took notes. Then the chairperson turned to Nora. Ms. Bennett. She smiled gently. It's Harper now. The chairperson nodded. Mrs. Harper, your response. Nora stood. Weeks earlier she would have looked toward Owen. This time she didn't. She opened the first binder. I appreciate concern for the orchard. She placed photographs on the table. These are improvements completed over the past 6 weeks. New irrigation lines, roof repairs, updated refrigeration equipment. She opened another binder. Here are payroll records showing every employee retained. Another. These are supply contracts negotiated at lower seasonal rates. Another. These are harvest reports showing our strongest production in 4 years. The room grew quiet. She wasn't speaking from emotion. She was speaking from evidence. One board member adjusted his glasses. Mrs. Harper. Who prepared these reports? I did. And who made these operational decisions? I did. Another member looked toward Victor. Mr. Bennett, were you aware of these improvements? Victor hesitated. They don't change the larger issue. What larger issue? She's inexperienced. Nora smiled politely. I was. Everyone looked at her. I've learned something every day since my father passed away. She glanced briefly toward the window overlooking the valley. I'll keep learning tomorrow. She looked back at the board. But inexperience isn't neglect. Silence settled across the room. The chairperson reviewed the documents one final time. Then she closed the last binder. The board finds no evidence of financial mismanagement. Victor's jaw tightened. The complaint is dismissed. For the first time in months, there were no conditions. No deadlines. No uncertainty. The matter was over. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the courthouse steps. Nora stood quietly, breathing in the crisp autumn air. Owen joined her. You did all that yourself. She smiled. I know. You didn't need me. She turned toward him. I've needed you every day. He looked confused. I didn't answer those questions. No. You handled everything. I did. She stepped a little closer. But confidence isn't something you handed me. What then? It's something you helped me discover. For a moment neither spoke. Cars passed slowly along Main Street. Somewhere nearby, church bells marked the hour. Nora reached into her coat pocket. She removed a folded envelope. I wrote this last night. What is it? Our agreement. He frowned. The one we signed before the wedding. I had a lawyer prepare the paperwork. She offered it to him. If you still want your freedom. Her voice softened. I'll sign today. Owen looked at the envelope. Then at her. Instead of taking it, he gently folded her fingers back around it. I don't want it. She searched his face. You don't. He shook his head. When you knocked on my door that night. He smiled. I thought I was helping save an orchard. She laughed quietly. So did I. But somewhere between fixing fences, burning pies, rebuilding signs, and watching you become exactly who you were meant to be. He reached for her hand. This stopped feeling temporary. Tears gathered in her eyes. You know what finally convinced me? What? The morning they rebuilt that sign. She looked toward him. I realized something. What? You don't inherit a home. He squeezed her hand gently. You build one. A tear slipped down her cheek. She laughed through it. You always wait until I'm crying to say something that good. I've got terrible timing. The worst. She leaned forward and kissed him, not because a trust required it, not because paperwork demanded it, simply because it was true. Winter arrived quietly in Briar Ridge. Snow settled across the orchard in soft white blankets. The trees rested. The harvest season ended. But life didn't. The farmhouse no longer echoed with silence. There were muddy boots by the back door, 2 coffee mugs beside the sink each morning. Notes on the refrigerator reminding Owen to pick up feed and reminding Nora about supplier meetings. Sometimes they still argued. Usually over little things. Who forgot to close the chicken coop? Whose turn it was to grocery shop? Whether Owen's old truck was finally beyond saving. The arguments never lasted long. Because they had learned something far more valuable than winning. They had learned how to stand on the same side. When spring finally returned, the orchard bloomed more beautifully than anyone in Briar Ridge could remember. Visitors came from neighboring counties just to walk beneath the white blossoms. Children laughed between the rows of trees. Families filled baskets with fruit later that summer. One afternoon Harold stood beside Owen watching the orchard come alive again. "Your wife built something special." Owen smiled. "No." Harold looked at him. "She reminded all of us what was already worth protecting." Across the orchard, Nora laughed as she helped a young girl reach an apple hanging just beyond her fingertips. The wind carried her ladder through the trees. Owen watched her for a long moment. Months earlier, she'd arrived at his farmhouse carrying fear in a metal cash box. Now she carried hope wherever she walked. And he realized that sometimes the most unexpected knock on the door wasn't the interruption of a quiet life. Sometimes, it was the beginning of the life you were always meant to live.